سلام. در این شماره با دکتر آمنه ودود، استاد مطالعات اسلام، پژوهشگر و مفسر قرآن، فعال حقوق زنان و نویسنده کتاب قرآن و زن گفتگو خواهیم کرد. محوریت این گفتگو تلاش‌های او برای ارائه خوانشی زنانه نگر از قرآن و به طور کلی بازخوانی مسئله جنسیت در اسلام با تاکید بر قرآنه. در کنار اینها با خانم ودود درباره تجربه طولانیشون از کنشگری در جوامع اسلامی چه در کشورهای مسلمان و چه در غرب صحبت خواهیم کرد. این گفتگو به زبان انگلیسی انجام خواهد شد و بعدتر برای شنوندگان فارسی زبان زیرنویس به اون اضافه خواهیم کرد. Dear Dr. Wadud, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. I'm really happy to be with you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Sure. Let me start off by providing some context about how your works have been received in the Iranian community. Our Persian audience know you more than anything else by your first book, The Qur'an and Woman. Its Persian translation has published in 2014, and I just remember how we enjoyed reading your book at that time. There were obviously some other books, maybe a lot about the topic of woman and Islam or the dignity of women in Islam and things like this, but titles like this, but they were written from a very kind of traditional perspective. Lots of them by ulama, some of them even by female scholars, but they were just trying to justify the patriarchal interpretations of the Quran. And I'm sure that you're familiar with this kind of literature inside the Islamic communities. It still exists, actually. So the extraordinary, or let's say revolutionary aspect of your book for us at that time was that we saw for the first time that a Muslim female scholar claims that the Quran's interpretations are male-centered. So that was kind of a window open for us. Muslim young girls like me, for example, who may always ask, and being asked actually about Islam's perspective or Quran's perspective on women versus like الرجال قوامون على النساء or واللاتي تخافون نشوزهن فعظوهن واهجروهن في المضاجع واضربوهن. I mean, you began your introduction of the book with this sentence, I quote, "My objective in undertaking this research was to make a reading of the Quran that would be meaningful to women living in the modern era." And this was something valuable to us. Now, I'm just going to ask you, how did that happen to you? Where did you get the idea of refusing male interpretations of the Quran? And then how did you shape your specific reading of the text?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I always begin in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and in all other matters. I ask Allah's forgiveness for any errors that I might make due to the frailty of being human. I love this question. I think the reason I love this question is because now that the book is in fact, more than 3 decades old, people kind of forget that, I was a PhD student. I was Muslim by choice. I had fallen in love with the Quran in just an English translation, which today I cannot even abide by. It's so patriarchal. But when I was reading it at that time, I thought I need to remove everything between me and this text. I really need to, understand the text. So of course, I immersed myself in the study of Arabic and moved and lived in the Middle East, North African region a couple times for study and, for reflection, principally focused on the language so that I could have a better handle on interpreting the Quran. It just so happens that one of the experiences that I had when I was doing an intensive Arabic course, I had a tutor from, I think, Cairo University, who was a Quran specialist. And our method of reading, because it was one-on-one, was that we would, read the Quran and then he would tell me what it means. And that worked fine for a long time. And then we came to something where when he told me what it meant, I just couldn't, it just didn't resonate. And it turned into such an argument that the director of my program had to intervene. Later on, I will talk about this experience because everything that I did was to question his methodology. What was the method that you used to come to, this interpretation? And everything he was responding from was from his authority and, respecting his knowledge. And, so I wasn't saying that he didn't know. I was simply saying, well, how do you know? And that's the thing I think that's principal about this little book, and that is it really grapples with the question of methodology. And for me, the parallel aspect of my study as a PhD student was in hermeneutics. I really came to understand the power and the magic of words, but also how fickle they can be. So people can be using the same word, but they mean something totally different. And so they'll be arguing past each other, but not understanding that their attachment to their definition was what kept them from being able to have a parallel conversation. So for decades, whenever I would give a talk about, Islam or Qur'an or, anything within, Islamic traditions, I would say my definitions first. Now, you could disagree with my definitions, and then we can talk about that. But if you know where I'm coming from, if you know how I'm using a word, then when I, say certain things, maybe even that seems, far-fetched or controversial, if you relate to the definition that I gave beforehand, you will see that it's consistent with my definition. One of the things, I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about it, but one of the things that really inspired me working with policy reform and, groups focused on Muslim women's real, lived realities was that we were running with a definition of Islam that presupposed hegemony, that presupposed somebody had to be on top of everything. We were not working with a definition of Islam as I understand it, which is about musawa, which is about reciprocity, mutual support, interdependence, and also, some inter-challenges, So I don't believe in the hegemonic definition of Islam. I just see Islam as a unifying system. The main energy of that, the spirit of that, the soul of that, the vitality of that is, of course, Allah al-Hayy, the living God. And when you think Islam is what my teacher taught me, what my mother taught me, what we do in my community, what we've done in my country, it may not synchronize all the time with the way in which I understand Islam. So that was already in the workings as I was doing my research about gender in the Quran. But I also noticed that of the classical works, we had none with women's voices, like none. Doesn't mean that women didn't know the Quran, doesn't mean that women didn't memorize the Quran, doesn't mean that women didn't think about the Quran, doesn't even mean that they didn't speak about it. But we don't have a written record from the classical period of voices of women about the Quran, let alone a full treatise. And I said, we've been reading the Quran from the lived realities of men, and they are not the totality of humanity. Humanity also exists of women. Now, I don't want to go long on this right now, but that is a binary that I hope to, express within a context of essential elements and not of biology, okay? But biologically, as a woman, there are certain things that I experienced, and there's certain things I experienced with the Quran when I fell in love with it that were not expressed in that literature. And I didn't feel that the problem was with the Quran. I felt that the problem was not just interpretation, but how certain interpretations become authoritative. And they become so authoritative that we have to remove them in order to really get back at, well, what is Quran saying, and how does this particular passage fit into other passages, that it is connected to, but also fit into passages that are similar on a similar theme, and then to the whole spirit of the Quran. And that's really what I learned from hermeneutics. So I really tried to invoke that in the work that I did. I had zero knowledge that it was controversial. I simply wanted to express the experience that I was having with the Quran as a text, as a sacred text, as guidance, as the word of Allah. I mean, all of these aspects were impacting the way that I understood it. We may want to take a break because I have 4 mosques in my neighborhood and they are all very loud.
Yeah, it's nice actually to hear space there.
They'll be here for a minute because So as I was studying, for my PhD, I also had a Quran specialist as my advisor on this project, and we sometimes would also clash over. He had just sort of the traditional patriarchal kind of location. And really, hadn't experienced that that location wasn't itself universal, that it was a particular interpretation that came from a particular experience. But it also helped me because it helped me from then on to understand that just as there are, hundreds of books written interpreting the Quran, there are also hundreds of different perspectives, and there's a lot of overlap. But there's also some places where I think those things could use the voice of an embodied female experience. And I tried to bring that. The first task, of course, was to kind of get a survey in my head of, what kinds of discussions were there. And then to sort of categorize those discussions for the sake of, the different chapters. But I had no inhibitions to centering, my own lived reality into the interpretation of the Quran. Of course, the next task was to give a clear methodological argument for the validity of that interpretation, even if it disagreed with something else, that may have been, a standard or considered authority or whatever. So that's kind of what the experience has been like for me.
Yeah. About this hegemonic system that you talked about, my second question is sort of related to that. Your book is written nearly 30 years ago. It's kind of a long time ago, but still its arguments are valid today. For you as the author, you must be proud of this, writing such a book that could be read today with enthusiasm after 30 years. But on the other hand, isn't kind of disappointing that even today we need still to talk about those issues. We still need to argue that women and men are not just their biology. We still need to argue about the influence of patriarchal context of interpreting the Quran on our understanding and all those issues. My question is that, how do you feel about it? Have you ever been disappointed of making changes? Don't you think that, the core of this male authority Islamic tradition is so hard that we could not penetrate it, and to change it to an egalitarian perspective, an alternative? Do you have, I don't know, do you have interactions with these male authorities during these years? I'm sure that you had.
I certainly have in all the years that I have been, trying to put this forward. And if you think about it, I completed my PhD in 1988, and that's when the dissertation was completed. And I still had the 3 years that I put into it, 85 to 88, I was working on, the research and getting the dissertation written. So for me, it is quite old, but you're right, it is essential. And the reason why I think it's essential, it's not just, the personal ego, which of course I also have, but it's because when I was finally taken out of the classroom and put into a context, which was here in Southeast Asia, working with an organization called Sisters in Islam, I realized that those interpretations have become so entrenched. They are also embodied in the law, and in particular Muslim personal status law or Muslim family law. And they are put there without condition, as if that's the only way to do this, So remember that you have to think about the book as theory, but theory is only as good as its ability to be able to put into implementation. But that was not on my mind when I was writing it. So in each situation, where I would encounter, these pushback voices, which were some of them quite interesting, some of them quite aggressive. I didn't have the facility that I feel like I have now in order to point out certain things, like, for example, how do you define a certain thing, And the reason is because patriarchy, which, by the way, is neither unique to or specifically Islamic, patriarchy has been the way of the entire planet for thousands of years. I mean, like, no exaggeration. And so it has affected many cultures. And, it's not so easy to get out of it, for example, just by throwing in the word feminist, for example, because even that's a contested term. But what I try to do with the conversations, that I have to have in these situations is to try to demonstrate the logic that I'm bringing to my understanding of the Quran, my understanding of Islam, my understanding of Allah. And that logic is motivated by Tawheed. It is motivated by the unity of Allah, and Tawheed, coming from the second form of the verb, means an emphatic term. So it means that Allah is not just one, which Allah is one, but it means also that Allah unites. And to me, this relationship between, let's just go back and not say male and female, let's say masculine and feminine, because those characteristics exist, in all of us. But there is a working relationship, with regard to them that can get hegemonic. The idea that the Quran is for all times, all places, and all people means that the lived reality of women, I will say women as, cisgendered humans, that our reality is as important to how the Quran becomes part of living text being implemented in culture as well as, and in fact, more particularly in law and policy. That patriarchy presumes that whenever any two things are together, one has to be on top. The musawa, or the equality Tawhidic method, is that the only thing on top is Allah. And that means that masculine, feminine, male and female can only work on the line of horizontal reciprocity. So I spend less time trying to counter patriarchal, hegemonic, binary readings, as I spend less time on that than I spend on trying to assert the understanding of equality and reciprocity as the way for us to achieve our highest capacity, and insan al-kam, our highest capacity as human beings. And that it does not distinguish, therefore, between male and female or a man and a woman. It only distinguishes on the basis of your heart and your deeds. So, we say taqwa and amal saleh, So even though these voices are still there, and I will say a little bit something about their perniciousness in just a minute, but even though those voices are still there, I don't confirm those voices. I consider those voices as particular to an understanding which is, hegemonic. I don't consider them the voice of Allah. In fact, I have the arrogance to say the voice of Allah only belongs to Allah and that each of us have to hear it. So as a consequence, I no longer argue with people. I might get frustrated, but I don't argue with them. I used to argue because I used to think that it was just a question of them coming to understand. And then I realized, how can any understanding motivate someone to give up their privilege? So the patriarchal hegemonic reading, and it's all over our literature, the classical works on ethics, obviously the fiqh, all of that. It's all built on the superiority of men. You're not going to give that up because somebody comes along and starts talking about Musawa, So I don't argue against that. Instead, I try to drop seeds of understanding of the power of uniting under a law, not only for our interpretation of text, but for how we live our lives. And therefore to be able to encounter all kinds of, things that you could not even predict that you would come across, that you would be able to encounter those, but you would still be operating from within the core of an experience of the reality of the presence of Allah, that you live in surrender to that presence, and that presence is in fact universal. It is ours, no matter cis female body, as much as it has been the men's across history. So yes, they're still there. Mostly it's based on privilege. It's very difficult for people to give up privilege. And it's also difficult in some cases for people to recognize that they have a privilege. They think they got what they got because they deserve it. I deserve to be in charge. I deserve to be on top, as opposed to maybe we all deserve, the privilege, or maybe none of us deserve the privilege. And instead, come back to, interdependency and mutual responsibility, reciprocity. So yes, it's still there. I find that there are places where if you have not heard an alternative, you think that's the only way, and then someone comes along and they try to present, oh, well, why don't we look at it this way? What if we look at it in, what I call that Tawhidic paradigm way? I'm not taking anything away from anyone. I am affirming the necessity and the dignity of everyone, under Allah. So that's my method to address it, and it kind of doesn't garner the same amount of attention that when you argue straight used to garner, because people just like to argue, like I don't really want to argue. I just want to affirm the reality of Allah.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Now I'm going to go a bit forward to your next book, Inside Gender Jihad. The most fascinating part of that book for me was in the section Quran, Gender, and Interpretive Possibilities, when you talk about the situation that, I quote, the text actually states something unmeaningful from the perspective of current human developments and understandings. And your solution was brave for me. You consider rejecting the text as a possibility, although you were aware of the risk of being accused of heresy, or at least locating yourself outside the Islamic scholarship. I would like to hear from you about that approach, which I think it's a bit different from your approach in the first book, Qur'an and Woman. In the first book, you tried to interpret every single word of the Quran from an egalitarian point of view. But here in your second book, you acknowledge that some parts of the Quran might be unmeaningful today. We should give up interpreting them. Could you explain a bit about this shift? And
yes, so I never said we should give up interpreting them, and I never said we should get rid of them. Okay. What I say is we cannot operate to fulfill the Quranic mission for Islam if we take only the hegemonic reading of them. And in particular, I did an analysis, a breakdown of, the existence of a verse that says, "Whether woman and strike them." And so, and again, I'm going to repeat this point just before I go into just a little bit more, and that is to say, yes, it's in the Quran. Yes, I agree with it, that it's in the Quran. Yes, I accept the Quran, the whole of the Quran. And because of the Quran and because of my relationship with Allah, I understand that not everything that is in the Quran has a literal application today. So a literal application of what the Quran means that men should be women. That's the literal. In Quran and Woman, what I said is there is a sort of trajectory of meaning, sort of you follow the trajectory, even, just from using the Quran, then it would not go there. And inside the gender jihad, I said, let's just take it as literal. And let's just say that the trajectory of the Quran aligns with the lived reality or the experiences of believers. Muslim women are believers, and the reality of domestic violence is given enough evidence now for us to know that it violates everything about the Quran. So we say, yes, it's there. Yes, it had. So in fact, in that chapter, I talk about 4 interpretive, responses, and one was to say, yes, it's there, and we do it, and that's it, no judgment or whatever. But actually, when you look at all of the discussion about that verse, you see that it is laden with conditions. None of these conditions are given specifically in the Quran, which means that there is already an interpretive, well, maybe that's not exactly, or I call it yes, but. Yes, it's in the Quran, but, you don't hit a woman to break her limbs or, whatever. This is what the jurors would say, And that's an important point to understand, that even patriarchal, hegemonic, conservative male readers were placing conditions on it. And as soon as you place conditions on it, it points to something that is potentially problematic. And so I do consider it problematic. Then I looked at what I call feminist interpretations, and that was maybe not. Maybe this isn't what it means. Maybe it means, something else. And there's enough literature that supports that. However, I took the next step. And that step was, no, we do not apply this verse to our families. It is not just. It is not a demonstration of dignity. It's not a demonstration of honor. So all of this karama that's part of, the human reality according to the creation that's given in the Quran, but karamna bani Adam, we gave humans this, dignity. It means that we do not apply that verse today because it violates not only our realities, but our realities as part of our belief in Islam, and therefore for me, it violates Islam. So it's important to understand. I'm not saying you don't interpret it. I'm not saying you take it out of the Quran. I was accused of that, but I've never said that. And I also give other parallels, particularly because I am a descendant of, African peoples who were enslaved in the Americas. There's still slavery in the Quran. And yet, I don't personally know, I do know that people still enslave people. I don't personally know anyone who would say slavery is okay. So the idea that there were certain things that operated in a practical sense in a certain context, and that we have from that context an example of how that situation was handled in that context, not meant to be an order for all times and all places. Rather, there is the, some interpreters say, if there is a disruption of the marital harmony, what are the steps you would take? So if we take it as disruption of marital harmony, then the focus is on regaining harmony. Focus is not on how we beat people. So, you know, we kind of bring the Qur'an away from the place where I was, you know, when I was doing my dissertation and when I, you know, wrote Qur'an and Woman, which was a place that simply said, let's just look at it linguistically. Let's just look at the language. I went from the language to the lived reality. And in the lived reality, the answer is absolutely, positively, no, we do not beat a woman. It's not just.
Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting explanation about the two levels of the works, like one in the linguistic level and the other in the working with reality of the life of women. Yeah, that's a very good point to know and consider.
I have some work that I'm doing now on sexuality, and you know, one of the questions that I ask myself as I go into the process of the research and then, you know, trying to find circumstances for application is, who is harmed by my interpretation, and who is helped by my interpretation. And when we re-emphasize the objective of the Quran, which is, you know, for the people, we have to think about, you know, our decency with regard to people. And that's when we realize that, okay, well, maybe at that time, the way to deal with someone who stole something would be to cut their hand off. We are not doing that today. And actually, that's better. We have other ways to deal, you know, with someone who steals. So to understand that, but to understand it as, again, the trajectory of the spirit of the Quran. It's not ever something to go against the Quran. It's simply to say, if we were to follow this. So my first research project in Arabic was a research project on slavery. And within the Quran, there are 13 different opportunities for manumission, for freeing a slave. But there's only one condition for which one can enter slavery, and that is as prisoners of war. There's no buying or selling of slaves in the Quran. Now, that was part of the culture, so that went along with it, you know. But if we were to look at one way in and 13 ways out, then to me, it says if we were following that trajectory, we would understand that that's not where we're supposed to be. We're not supposed to enslave other humans, even though it was done at the time, you know, of the revelation.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned your recent project, and actually my next question is about your more recent project these years, Queer Islamic Theology, which I think is a very new branch in Islamic theology. Could you first explain a bit about its meaning and principles? And then I'm eager to know more about the results of this project that you did. The traditional reading and interpretation of gender in the Quran are mostly based on the notion of Zawj and the binary language of the Quran, actually. And the text is not only written in a gender-specific language, but also has a huge emphasis on describing gender in a binary way, I think. I think even most of the literature on feminist reading of the Quran and Islam is also based on this dualism of creation, actually. Now, are we going to revise these interpretations to a non-binary view of gender, and if yes, why and how we are going to revise this?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in that question, and let me try to, you know, be strategic to try to cover as many of them as possible. First of all, I don't think the Quran is binary. I think Arabic language is binary. And the Quran was revealed to an Arabic-speaking prophet, Muhammad, who speaks Arabic. So I said that twice. So it uses the language that, you know, was his language. That language is riddled with the binary. In fact, one of the exercises that we do in our workshops is to take just Qul Allahu Ahad, you know, Ayatul Kursi, she's having a moment, Ikhlas, you know, the Surah Ikhlas. We take that one and we go through several different languages, and you'll appreciate this because this is true also in Farsi. Not all languages are binary. So Bahasa Indonesia also is not binary. We have one pronoun, and that pronoun is for he, she, they, it. I mean, it's all of it. Okay, English, we've got 3 different words. In Arabic, they've got 2. And not only do they have 2, everything is encoded with markers based on those 2. So it's a lot harder to understand my proposal here that it's not the Quran that's binary, it's the Arabic language. But because you do have Farsi as, you know, your native language, you can understand that sometimes we understand which gender is being designated because of the context. But here in Indonesia, it is not uncommon for my friends, even those who are fluent in English, to say things like, you know, my husband, she's, coming from work now, and, you know, my wife, he is, a doctor. I mean, you know, whatever, you know, they will use a different pronoun than the one that we quote unquote know is correct in English, because they don't have to have a marker for gender in their language. So sometimes it's hard for us to separate that. If the Quran is in, al-lugha al-arabiyya, then that means that, everything is divine. I don't believe Arabic is a divine language. I don't believe any languages are divine. I believe that the divine is metalingual, is beyond, just a certain language. And then that metalingual is filtered through particular human languages, and all human languages have what, I was taught is exuberances and deficiencies. And a deficiency in Arabic language is an inability to articulate the inclusive. And so everything is divided, and it affects the way people think. They think that the binary is necessary. In your instance, for example, you think the Quran is binary. I don't, because, again, my journey was to fall in love with the Quran in English, and then step back and start studying Arabic for the next 10 years and do as much intensive work in more than one country that I could to, be really, proficient. And I love the language, but I'm also frustrated by its inability to create what I call the generic. In fact, in Arabic, the sentence that says, that someone is pregnant, who are hamil, is he is pregnant in the masculine. That's the generic form of the word pregnant, is hamil. And that's the masculine form. So what we see is a slight incongruence with reality because of this binary constraint of the language. Now, for me, the research opportunity that I had with regard to looking at what I call sexual diversity and human dignity was based on, experience of, being active in the LGBTQI Muslim inclusive movements, but also because all of the work that I had done, I've been doing this for 20 years, all the work that I'd done in this area, I had done on only secondary sources. And I really wanted an opportunity to go back to primary sources because they had worked so well for me in terms of looking at gender in the Quran. So I went back and did a research, and the basis of that was fascinating in more than one way. One of them being that we already had a studies of sexuality. Ilm al-Ba' was a part of classical Islamic studies, and it got filtered out negatively through the colonial experience. And after colonial experience, we have this faulty memory where we have this, the taboo even to have a discussion about matters of sexuality. But that was not the tendency in the past. It was very thorough. It was medical, it was psychological, it was spiritual. I mean, Ilm al-Bah was very comprehensive. So what I am requesting now is that we reintegrate the studies of sexuality into the studies of Islam. And so I have started an online initiative called Queer Islamic Studies and Theology, or QIS, which is an Arabic word for justice, and it's applied justice. And the two elements are important because the studies part has to do, again, with the lived realities. The lived reality is not everyone is binary. I don't identify as binary. I identify as non-binary. Not everyone is binary, and not everyone believes that human relationships are only built on the reproductive, couple. Some people believe that relationships are built out of love or family or, mutual support or care or, spiritual fulfillment or identity, whatever. There are other reasons. And we also have a very sex positive kind of understanding of marriage and sexuality in Islamic history. So the idea that, we want to shut down as taboo the discussion of certain topics instead of really examining them deeply and also understanding how the basic dignity of a human being can continue to flourish when we basically deny them their identity and their legitimacy as Muslims. So this is multiple imperatives for me, but the second part of the title, Studies in Theology, is to once again examine the sacred sources and to examine them with the understanding of inclusivity and equality and reciprocity and dignity. I think I need to keep saying that. And that's just a small initiative now because the studies of sexualities have begun. And in other cases, it's secular, or there may be religious studies of sexualities, which I've participated in some events. But the idea to bring this into Islamic studies, like patriarchy, is just a little bit sticky, But there's so much that can be discussed with regard to it. Right now, I've been working on what I call the ambiguity of Quranic guidance. Because in the research, of course, I started with the Quran because that's my, main research interest. And then I went to the tafsir. Then I looked at the hadith and the seerah of the Prophet, and then I looked at the fiqh. But I only looked at the first 500 years of Islamic history because I really wanted to see what the initial discourses were like. Again, they were much more inclusive. They were much more direct. And there wasn't that kind of taboo. That all came in after the period that I used for my study. But I did also find that there are some aspects of the Quranic discussion that is, I believe, intentionally ambiguous, and that ambiguity is, in fact, one of the aspects of guidance. That sometimes Allah can kind of put things together in a way that you don't quite get. What is this juxtaposition? How are these things related? And in that ambiguity of relationship is, in fact, a transformative potential. And so that's, for me, I think, what happens with regard to the studies of sexuality vis-a-vis the Quran. There's not a lot in it, but there is enough in it for us to understand that there are ambiguous people, and that ambiguity is accepted in who don't desire women, or that kind of thing. So it's subtle, but we now live in a time where the imperative is much greater. Because actually, we are dealing with increased numbers of people who accept their identities as, gay, lesbian, bisexual, polyamorous, which is polygamous, which is part of our history as well, or asexual. And to understand that as a reality means that either Islam is universal, it is for all times, all places, and all people, or Islam is particular. It is only for heterosexuals. And if that's the case, then it means that the whole human project of human dignity and insan al-kamil, karamna bani Adam, that karama isn't universal. And I don't believe that. I believe it's universal, but I believe that we have historically slipped back from our capacity to at least engage in the conversation. And from that engagement to then do justice, honor, and dignity to all persons, no matter their gender locations.
That is really interesting. I mean, the point you said about the ambiguity in the Quran, and also its relation to kind of, I mean, it's not related to colonialism, but the way we read the Quran after the colonialism era. And I think there are lots of studies about how colonialism actually affected Islamic studies and our approach to Islamic studies as well. And it's very interesting that you talked about the kind of pre-modern or pre-colonialism readings of sexuality in the Quran. I really, I was not aware about that, and I think that
I wasn't either. That's one reason why I try to mention it as much as possible, because we kind of believe when people, people say there's no homosexuality in the Quran, and then they point to the passages about the Prophet Lut. And there was no word for homosexuality at that time in any language, right? And so how do we get at that, right? Just because you don't have a name for a thing doesn't mean the thing doesn't exist, right? But then also for me, my emphasis is not on homosexuality. My emphasis is on sexual diversity. And then when you look at cultures, the cultures, in Indonesian culture, they had, for example, the Bisu people who were gender non-binary people who performed certain functions in the, sort of the community's ritualistic, events and celebrations and stuff, So there was a place that was understood as, the acceptance. And in fact, there's supposed to be special barakah in that, So the idea of sexual diversity to me does not reduce it to, simply the sex act. It instead makes it clear that human beings have many, aspects or features, and one of the features is our sexuality, and that sexuality should be in a healthy integration with our worship, with our family, with how we are treated, how we treat others, and etc. So I try to make it bigger than just limiting it to, sort of the controversial emphasis that, everybody is a Qur'an expert when it comes to the passages.
Yes.
And I thought, okay, so then I'm going to find the answer when I go in there. And instead, I was faced with more and more ambiguity. And I finally realized, that's the point. The point is that some things we must use our own souls, our own, intellect, our consciousness. We must use that in order to understand what is therefore the application of this. Not just the letter of the Quran, but the application. And, and that was inspired by my work on gender, even in the binary sense. But, it took a little bit of challenging for me to come to a place where I understood that, there is no set answer. And therefore, the mark of our excellence, the mark of our excellence is our ability to embrace with equality and dignity all persons, and to understand that all persons have this relationship with Allah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Now I would like to ask a question about an issue that I think is kind of important for our Persian audiences, the issue of veil, specifically head covering, and what the Quran says about it. I think you know about Iran and the protests in Iran recently in 2022, and I mean maybe the starting point of these protests was something about being against the mandatory veil, actually. And this actually raised a wave of debates and also reactions about this issue, even among committed Muslims. I also think that through last decades, the issue of veiling has got more attention in the field of women and Islam. I can recall Leila Ahmed's book, A Quiet Revolution, which discusses the veil resurgence from Middle East to America in recent decades. So returning to your first book, I think you did not mention this issue there, maybe because it was not something, a challenging topic for women in 80s, for example. But I think nowadays...
Actually, the 80s was a very powerful transformative period. That's where a sort of standardized version of hijab and the universalization of the word in hijab came about. But it's not a central topic of the Quran.
Yeah.
Quran and Woman is about those two things. And it's not an essential topic.
Okay.
In the Quran, the essential topic is modesty, libas taqwa, and the covering of piety or modesty is not a particular outfit. And I have never been in favor of mandatory or covering, even though it is my public practice. I don't, when I say public now, I don't mean, going, to the store to buy chicken. I don't cover when I go to the store to buy chicken, because I live in a Muslim majority country, which coincidentally has never had a mandatory veil policy, even though they went through that transformation in the 80s as well. And as a consequence, the vast majority of Muslim women are covered here. But if you are not covered, no one makes an issue. So all of my ID, I'm covered because it's a political statement as well as a spiritual, choice. But if I show that ID when I go to the airport, I don't have any scarf on. Nobody ever says anything. Whereas in the United States, I never go to the airport without having on hijab because it's political, In the case of those places where modesty has been inextricably linked only to head covering, the battle still wages on. And that would be those places that prohibit women from covering, like certain places in the EU, as well as those places that prohibit women from uncovering. I believe that the agency and the dignity of a woman is that we give her the choice and that we actually respect her no matter which choice she makes. That doesn't exist. So when I live in the US, I don't feel like I get the respect as a Muslim woman that, I would prefer unless I'm covered. So I will cover in, all these situations. Whereas here, I do get the respect. It doesn't define my Islam. I also prefer to dress in a way that's noticeably as a Muslim, when I'm in these, politically charged kind of situations or doing, public events. That's my choice. And my choice is based on, again, the history of my ancestors where African women were brought to the Americas, like they were chickens in the market and stripped of their garments, including as many as 1/3 of the Africans and slaves believed to be Muslim. They were stripped of their garments. And so African-American women have a history of an assertion of a standard of modesty that is a little bit more comprehensive than was the culture, say, for white American women. And so, this kind of consciousness, this sort of bodily integrity, it's just, that's what I was raised with in the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, that's what I was raised in. So then by the time I become Muslim, it's just like, okay, well, now I have a way to design it, but, it's my preference. But when you do not allow a woman to make the preference, and when she's shamed or even physically, abused, because of the absence of it, that's not Islam. That cannot be Islam. Islam means surrender. You can't force modesty. There's no way you can force a person to cover, but you cannot force modesty. And the idea that we want to teach people to have modesty and teach people to respect each other, with modesty, that's missing from places where they coerce it, so, and sometimes, because of course in Iran, it's a unique situation because it literally is like the law and it's coerced, but there are other places where there's just kind of a cultural climate and kind of you feel like if you don't wear it, you also are, shamed or whatever. But, in all of these, what we seem to be expressing is not a concern for the bodily integrity of the woman. It's actually a concern for an image or an idea. And that idea is given precedent over the in fact, sort of the ethical understanding of, decorum and respect. So yeah, it's still a big issue in many places. I like to think about solutions to things like this, and I can't always think of a solution. I can only say that for whatever is the beauty, in making that choice, there's also beauty in not making that choice. And when we come to a place where we can treat each person with that equanimity, whether they choose to cover or uncover, then I think we have achieved what it is that I'm seeking for us to achieve.
Yeah, that's good. That's great. Yeah, thank you. My last question would be about Islamic feminism. Islamic feminism and feminist tafsirs of the Quran have developed in the 90s, more or less, and you're among the most prominent icons of this approach for sure. Apart from your books, your efforts and participation in movements for Muslim women's rights are extraordinary. You're among the founders of Sisters in Islam, the Network of Musawa. You are the Lady Imam, and as I said before, I think thousands of Muslim women have been inspired by your words and your efforts. However, we live in a different world now from what we might think of it in the 90s, for example. New generations of Muslim feminists have risen, maybe with different agendas and goals. My question is, how do you see the future of Islamic feminism, specifically if you're familiar with Islamic feminism in the, I don't know, if you're familiar with the Islamic feminism in Shia context and Iran, for example, I don't know. I would like to know.
Yes, yeah. I refuse to use the term feminist for myself, for most of my work. And I remember when I did a change, 2009 when Musawa was launched was when I came out as a feminist. And the reason that I needed that long was because I also, like so many people, I only understood feminism in white, middle-class, secular terms. Not just secular, sometimes anti-religious terms, or particularly anti-Islamic terms. It was like, I don't need that, But then later on, I realized, just like the word Islam needs to be defined and looked into as a historical trajectory, so does the word feminism. And the idea of feminism as, sort of the radical idea that women are human beings, according to Simone de Beauvoir. For me, I take from the Quranic understanding of, the discussion about Tawhid. We are given our complete dignity, our complete agency by the Quran as women. And no one should take that away from us. And if that's what you call feminism, then I'm a feminist. But it took me a long time to get there because the term is so politicized. But to understand that equally the term Islam is also politicized, like, Islam means terrorism to, the anti-terror people of the United States or something like that, right? There are people that's what that means, and I never had that experience. I don't know, I've seen certain things, but why would I take that as Islam? I've met so many, wonderful, peaceful people, so many countries across the world. Why would that be Islam for me? And also I'm a student and, a scholar and, so I'm not defining Islam the way they're defining Islam. Why would I define feminism the way of only those with a very limited amount of understanding? And so I have reclaimed it. However, I do make a distinction. I do have a trajectory of understanding, and that is that not every Muslim feminist is an Islamic feminist. Because some Muslim feminists are Muslims who are feminists, and they adhere to a feminism which is in fact not just secular, but anti-religion. And that's the only feminism that they know, and that's the only feminism that they need to know, and I'm happy for them. But for me, that's not my feminism. So I have to demonstrate how I derive my feminism from my study and belief in Islam. So Islamic feminism uses Islamic sources to promote the idea of equality and reciprocity and human dignity. Muslim feminists use anything. They can use, secular arguments, they can use sociological, political argument, and it's all great. And the reason why it's all great is because in the end, to stand up for the full human dignity of women is important. But I can only stand up as an Islamic feminist. I cannot stand up, using secular feminists or, anti-religious feminists. It doesn't work for me. So it's a personal choice for me, but I also try to politicize it by looking at the history and the evolution of feminism, feminist thought, and how that thought entered into different social and cultural contexts, and therefore shaped the way those contexts, would look at feminism. In Indonesia, the use of the term feminist is so light and so easy because women in this culture have been educated in, the pesantren, sort of, their classical school system. They are well versed in Islam. And 2 years ago, they launched KUPI, Congress Ulama Perempuan Indonesia, the Indonesian Women's Fatwa Council. It is a public assertion of women's capacity to give fatwa. So, here again, women work as judges, even the head judge. When I used to live in Malaysia, wow, the head judge. When in Malaysia, they were saying women can't be judges, and in Indonesia, women were the head judge, So the idea of feminism as an essential part of your identity, where you're not fighting to claim, I am for the dignity of women. Not only am I for the dignity of women, I'm for it because of my Islam. I'm for it because I believe in Allah. That's where we hope to go for the future. And the thing that's most interesting about it is, when I started working on gender, I did not see the landscape that I see today. The movement is not only strong, the movement is unstoppable. So we will achieve the equality that Allah gave us. I'm very excited about the next generations taking it forward. Trust me on that.
That was great because, I was talking to Dr. Ziba Mir Hosseini, and we just kind of wrap up our conversation with something like that you said right now. She said that I'm really positive about the future. And I was like, okay, that's really nice because we really need this hope to kind of continue this movement. I'm really happy that I hear it from you.
And I look forward to, the contributions of yourself and the next generation, because it is a momentum now and it will not be stopped. Doesn't mean that we're not going to be pushed back. Doesn't mean that there's not going to be some pressure. Doesn't mean there's not going to be problems. But in the end, you just can't stop the tide.
That's great. Thank you. As the final point, we would like to hear if you want to share anything with our audiences that I did not ask about it. I also know about your page on my Patreon, and there are lots of contents on it. If you want to introduce any book or any other resources to our audiences for further reading or investigation in all these fields that we talked about we are.
Oh, that's so nice. I should do like a little advert. So my most recent publication is called Once in a Lifetime. It is actually a spiritual memoir about the 5 pillars in Islam. All of the books that you ever read that introduced the 5 pillars of Islam were very conservative. And so in the year that I made Hajj, I was invited to do this blog series. And, I had really good experience of over the years getting it finally edited and organized into a little tiny book called Once in a Lifetime. It's my only non-academic book. I'm still my own voice, so obviously I'm a little bit, heavy on the intellectual side, but it is available through, you just put Once in a Lifetime in my name, it'll come up. I am on social media, on Patreon and YouTube as the Lady Imam. I am also in transformation because I think I have aged out of social media. So I no longer I have a public figure page on Facebook, but I don't go into it anymore, and I don't do Twitter. So if you really want more in-depth discussions, it's either my YouTube channel or my Patreon page. I do think that it is, and KIST, Queer Islamic Studies, QIST.com, 01 QIST. KIST is online as well. It's a free platform to support the efforts to reintegrate the studies of sexuality into Islam. So I do have some things out there, but, I'm 71.5 years old and, I need glasses. And it's like, you know what? I don't think I'm ever going to be on TikTok. So.
Okay, thank you so much. It was a pleasure for me to have this conversation with you, and I would like to thank you again for your time and your considerations about our audiences in Iran.
You're so very welcome. Salam alaikum. Good office.
Thank you.